Camp Echo was smack in the middle of nowhere. Dry land as far as the eye could see, with some scraggly bushes here and there. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to be, but there the soldiers were doing their job. Among them was the vet, a soldier who'd been around long enough to know a thing or two. He didn't say much, just did his work and kept to himself. The vet dropped his gear on the cot in the barracks and looked around. The place was noisy with soldiers joking and laughing. It wasn't real joy, just something to fill the quiet. The vet had heard all kinds of jokes before, so he just shook his head and started checking his rifle. Routine stuff, nothing special. That's when he saw it. Right there on the rifle, near the trigger, was a strange mark. It wasn't a scratch or something from wear and tear. No, this was different. It looked like a jagged little spiral sharp at the edges. The vet frowned and ran his finger over it. It felt smooth, like it had always been there. But he knew better. He'd never seen it before. "Hey, vet, lose something." A young soldier named Carter called from the doorway, grinning. The vet shook his head. "Nah, just checking my gear," he said. But his eyes kept going back to the mark. Something about it didn't sit right. That night, after dinner, the vet sat on a crate outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette and staring at the sunset. The camp was quiet now, with only the sound of boots crunching on gravel. He looked up and saw the surgeon walking over. The surgeon was tough as nails and didn't waste words. He lit a cigarette and stood there, quiet for a moment. Then the surgeon glanced at the vet's rifle, leaning against the crate. His eyes narrowed. "That got a mark on it?" he asked. The vet nodded. "Yeah, noticed it earlier. Thought maybe it's just a ding or something." The surgeon shook his head slowly. "That ain't no ding," he said, his voice low. He leaned in, almost whispering. "They're tracking you." The vet froze. "What are you talking about?" "Keep it quiet," the surgeon said, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "Don't tell anyone, and don't let that rifle out of your sight." Before the vet could ask more, the surgeon stubbed out his cigarette and walked off, leaving him with more questions than answers. The vet picked up the rifle and stared at the mark. In the fading light, it almost looked like it was glowing. He shook his head. Maybe he was just tired. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the vet lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling. The rifle was propped up right next to him. His hand rested on it, fingers brushing the cold metal. The mark stayed in his thoughts, buzzing like an itch he couldn't scratch. And just as he started to drift off, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, soft and far away, like a voice on the wind. The next day started like any other. Soldiers were up early, moving around the camp, doing their jobs. The vet was no different. He grabbed his rifle and joined the others for the morning drill. But even as he went through the motions, his mind was stuck on that mark. It was like a thorn in his thoughts, poking at him when he least expected it. At chow time, Carter plopped down next to him, grinning like always. "You're quiet today," Carter said, shoveling a spoonful of something that barely passed as food into his mouth. "What's on your mind?" The vet shook his head. "Nothing worth talking about," he muttered. Carter laughed. "Sure, you've got that I know something look. Come on, spill it." The vet looked around the room. The other soldiers were busy eating, talking, and joking. No one was paying attention. He leaned in a little closer to Carter. "Ever see a mark on your gear? Something that doesn't belong there?" Carter's grin faded a bit. He put his spoon down and scratched the back of his head. "What kind of mark?" "A spiral. Jagged edges," the vet said quietly. Carter's face changed just for a moment. It was quick, but the vet caught it. Fear. Carter forced a laugh and shook his head. "Nah, man, nothing like that. You're probably just seeing things." But his voice didn't have the usual joking tone. He stood up quickly. "I gotta go. Latrine duty. You know how it is." The vet watched him leave, his gut telling him Carter was lying. That night, the vet was back on his cot, the rifle by his side. The camp was quiet again, but not the good kind of quiet. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. He stared at the rifle, his eyes tracing the mark. The surgeon's words echoed in his head. "They're tracking you." Then he heard it. A whisper, soft but clear. It wasn't like before, faint and far off. This time it sounded closer. He sat up, gripping the rifle tight. The whisper came again, like someone was just outside the barracks. "Run," it said. The vet's heart pounded. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" He called out, but no one answered. Just silence. And then from the corner of the room came the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate. He turned quickly, raising his rifle, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Run before it finds you." The vet didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his cot, the rifle in his lap, eyes fixed on the door. Whatever was out there, he wasn't going to let it catch him off guard. The next morning, the camp felt different. The usual hum of voices and clattering of gear seemed quieter, like everyone was walking on eggshells. The vet noticed it right away. Soldiers weren't chatting as much, and when they did, it was in hushed tones. He caught a few glances in his direction, but no one said anything. Carter avoided him completely. Normally, the younger soldier was the first to crack a joke or sit with him at chow. But now Carter stayed on the other side of the mess hall, his head down, shoveling food like he couldn't wait to get out of there. The vet didn't push it. He had his own worries. The whisper from the night before was still fresh in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he walked back to his barracks, he caught sight of the sergeant standing near the edge of camp, staring out into the empty desert. The vet hesitated, then walked over. "Morning, Sarge," he said, keeping his voice casual. The sergeant didn't look at him. "Morning," he muttered. The vet followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" The sergeant finally turned to him, his face as hard as ever. "Nothing. Just keeping watch." The vet nodded, but he knew it wasn't nothing. The sergeant wasn't the type to waste time staring at nothing. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the sergeant cut him off. "How's your rifle?" "Fine," the vet said. "Haven't let it out of my sight." "Good," the sergeant said. "Keep it that way." With that, he walked off, leaving the vet with more questions than answers. As the day went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Soldiers whispered about strange sounds at night, about shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. One guy swore he saw footprints leading away from the camp, but when he followed them, they just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That night, the vet stayed awake again, his rifle across his lap. The barracks were quiet except for the occasional snore or rustle of someone turning over in their sleep. He kept his eyes on the door, listening for anything out of the ordinary. And then he heard it. A faint sound like breathing coming from the far corner of the room. His grip tightened on the rifle as he slowly turned his head. The corner was dark, too dark. He squinted, trying to see if something was there. "Run!" The whisper came again, so close it made his skin crawl. The vet jumped to his feet, aiming his rifle at the corner. "Who's there?" He barked, his voice sharp. The room was still. Too still. One of the other soldiers stirred, mumbling in his sleep, but no one woke up. The vet's eyes stayed locked on the corner, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he started to lower the rifle, a shadow moved, quick and silent, slipping out the door. The vet ran after it, his boots pounding against the floor. He burst out into the night, the cold air hitting him like a slap. But there was nothing there, just the empty camp, lit by the pale glow of the moon. He stood there for a long time, his heart racing, wondering if he was losing his mind. When he finally went back to his cot, he didn't sleep. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over. And he had a feeling it was only going to get worse. The morning started with a buzz of worry. One of the younger soldiers, a guy named Diaz, hadn't shown up for roll call. At first, people figured he was just oversleeping. Everyone did once in a while. But when a search of the barracks turned up nothing, things got serious. The vet joined the others as they combed the camp. Diaz's gear was still neatly packed, his bed untouched. It was like he had just vanished. The whispers started almost immediately. Soldiers muttered about shadows in the night and strange noises. The vet could see it in their faces. Fear was creeping in. By midday, the sergeant called everyone together. "We don't leave our own behind," he said firmly. "We're heading out to find him." The vet wasn't sure what they'd find, but he knew better than to argue. He checked his rifle again, his eyes lingering on the mark. It seemed sharper somehow, like the edges had grown darker. The search party moved out in pairs, spreading into the empty desert around the camp. The vet and Carter ended up together, walking in silence as the sun beat down on them. Carter kept glancing at the vet's rifle, but he didn't say anything. "See anything?" The vet asked after a while. Carter shook his head. No, you? Nothing. They walked a little farther, their boots crunching on the dry ground. Then Carter stopped, pointing ahead. What's that? The vet followed his finger and saw a faint trail of footprints. They were small like Diaz's, and they led toward a rocky outcrop. The two of them followed the trail, their rifles at the ready. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of a boulder, as if Diaz had simply disappeared. Where the hell did he go? Carter muttered. The vet didn't answer. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anything out of place. That's when he saw it. A mark carved into the rock. It was the same spiral, jagged and sharp, just like the one on his rifle. Carter saw it too. What the hell is that? I don't know, the vet said, his voice low. But I think we need to get back to camp. They turned to leave, but the air around them suddenly felt heavy, like it was pressing down on their chests. The vet gripped his rifle tighter, his senses on high alert. And then, just for a second, he thought he saw a shadow move between the rocks. Carter, he said quietly, stay close. But before Carter could respond, a scream tore through the air, echoing across the desert. It was coming from the direction of the camp. The two of them took off running, their boots kicking up dust as they raced back. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good, and the vet had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a whole lot worse. The camp was chaos by the time the vet and Carter got back. Soldiers were yelling, some pointing their rifles into the shadows beyond the camp perimeter. A few men were clustered near the mess hall, their faces pale as they whispered to each other. The vet immediately scanned the scene, his eyes darting to the barracks and supply tents, looking for signs of an attack. What happened? The vet barked, grabbing the nearest soldier. They came through, the soldier stammered, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the perimeter. Shadows, moving too fast to shoot. Took another one. Who? Carter asked, his voice shaking. Jacobson, the soldier muttered. Just gone. The vet felt a knot tighten in his stomach. 2 soldiers missing in one day, and no clear answers. He glanced over at the sergeant, who stood by the command tent, barking orders. The sergeant's face was hard, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The vet made his way over. Sarge, what's going on? The sergeant didn't answer right away. He stared at the perimeter, where a few soldiers were shining flashlights into the desert. Finally, he turned to the vet. They're testing us, he said quietly. Who's they? The vet asked, keeping his voice low. The sergeant looked at him, his expression grim. You know as much as I do. Maybe less. But if you've got that mark, you'd better keep your head down. Before the vet could press for more, the sergeant raised his voice and ordered the soldiers to double the patrols. The camp felt smaller now, the walls of the perimeter barely keeping out the fear that hung in the air like smoke. That night, the vet didn't sleep. He stayed by the fire near the center of the camp, his rifle across his lap. Carter sat next to him, his knee bouncing nervously. You think Diaz and Jacobson are still out there? Carter asked, breaking the silence. The vet didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, the flickering light reflecting in his tired eyes. I don't know, he said finally. But if they are, we're not doing them any favors sitting here. Carter nodded, though he didn't look convinced. You think it's connected? The mark in all this? The vet's fingers tightened around his rifle. Yeah, I do. As the fire crackled and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, the vet thought he heard something. A faint sound carried on the wind. It wasn't the whisper from before. It was deeper, almost like a growl. He stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the camp. Carter noticed and stood too, his rifle ready. What is it? Carter whispered. The vet didn't answer. He could feel it now, a presence just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was watching them. He raised his rifle, aiming into the darkness, and his voice was steady when he spoke. Come out. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. Then from the shadows came a low, guttural laugh. It sent a shiver down the vet's spine, but he didn't flinch. The laugh faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. We're not alone, the vet said quietly. Carter nodded, his grip on his rifle tightening. I think we figured that out. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but the vet didn't lower his guard. Whatever was out there, it wasn't finished with them yet. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the vet knew one thing for sure. Things were only going to get worse. The next morning came with a strange stillness. It wasn't the usual quiet of a tired camp. It felt more like the world itself was holding its breath. Soldiers moved about their routines, but their movements were slower, more cautious, like they were waiting for something to happen. The vet sat by his cot, his rifle across his lap. The mark on the metal seemed darker in the daylight, as if it had absorbed the fear and tension hanging in the air. He ran a finger over it, his thoughts racing. This thing, whatever it was, had brought trouble to the camp, and it wasn't done yet. The surgeon called the vet over after breakfast. He was standing near the perimeter, staring out into the open desert again. His face was as hard as ever, but his eyes looked tired. "We need to talk," the surgeon said, his voice low. The vet nodded, following him to a quiet spot away from the others. "What's going on, Sarge? You know something?" The surgeon took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "This isn't the first time," he said. "I'd seen marks like yours before. Different places, different times. Always ends the same." "What do you mean?" the vet asked, his grip tightening on the rifle. "People disappear. Shadows come. And it doesn't stop until—" The surgeon hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't stop until there's no one left." The vet frowned, gripping his rifle tighter. "Then what are we supposed to do? Just wait for this thing to pick us off one by one?" The surgeon's gaze hardened. "No. That's why I'm telling you this. The mark isn't just some random curse. It's a beacon, and whatever's out there, it's drawn to it. You've got to figure out why it marked you." The vet shook his head. "How the hell am I supposed to do that? I don't even know what it is." "That's for you to find out," the surgeon said. "You've got the best chance of anyone here. But don't waste time, because the longer you're marked, the worse it gets." The vet wanted to argue, but the look on the surgeon's face told him it was pointless. Whatever the surgeon had seen before, it had broken something in him. The vet nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right, but if I'm doing this, I'll need some help." The surgeon gave a small, grim smile. "You'll have Carter. He might not look it, but he's tougher than he seems. And for what it's worth—" The surgeon paused, then clapped the vet on the shoulder. "I hope you figure it out before it's too late." As the surgeon walked away, the vet sat down on a crate, staring out at the desert. His mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. Whatever was coming wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. That night, the camp was quieter than ever. Even the usual murmurs of conversation seemed to have died out. Carter sat by the fire, glancing nervously at the perimeter. The vet joined him, setting his rifle down beside him. "You okay?" Carter asked, his voice low. "Not really," the vet admitted, "but we've got work to do." Carter nodded, though his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the strap on his rifle. "What's the plan?" The vet stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. "We figure out what this thing wants, and we stop it, one way or another." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of their situation settling over them. In the distance, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a low, guttural laugh that made their blood run cold. The vet tightened his grip on his rifle. Whatever was out there, it was waiting, and they didn't have much time. The next day, the vet and Carter prepared to leave the camp. They didn't have much of a plan, but waiting around wasn't an option anymore. Whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until it got to them, or until they got to it first. The surgeon handed the vet a map, old and weathered but still legible. "There's an outpost about 10 clicks west of here," he said. "It's been abandoned for years, but if you're looking for answers, it's the only place I can think of." The vet nodded, folding the map and tucking it into his jacket. "You think we'll find something there?" The surgeon didn't answer right away. He just stared at the vet with that same grim look. "If you don't, it's over." Carter slung his rifle over his shoulder, his face pale but determined. "Guess we better get moving." The two of them left the camp as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert. The walk was quiet at first, the only sounds coming from their boots crunching on the dry ground and the occasional gust of wind. Carter tried to lighten the mood with a joke or two, but the vet barely responded. His mind was too focused on the mark and the feeling that something was following them. After a few hours, they stopped to rest near a cluster of rocks. Carter pulled out his canteen, taking a long drink before handing it to the vet. "So," Carter said, breaking the silence, You think this outpost is gonna have answers? Or are we just chasing ghosts? The vet wiped his mouth after taking a sip. At this point, I'll take ghosts over nothing. Carter chuckled nervously, but the sound was short-lived. The vet's eyes flicked to the horizon, narrowing as he scanned the landscape. Did you see that? See what? Carter asked, his voice dropping. The vet pointed to a ridge in the distance. For just a second, he thought he saw a figure, tall, dark, and still as a statue. But when he blinked, it was gone. Nothing, the vet said, though his grip on his rifle tightened. Let's keep moving. As they continued, the air grew heavier, colder despite the glaring sun overhead. Carter noticed it too. Feels like we're walking into a storm, he muttered, his eyes darting around. The vet didn't respond. He was too focused on the feeling crawling up his spine like they were being watched. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in the corners of his vision. A flicker of a shadow, a shape darting behind a rock. But every time he turned to look, there was nothing. By the time they reached the outpost, the sun was tipping low in the sky, casting the old structure in an eerie orange glow. The building was small, more of a shack than anything else, with cracked walls and a roof that looked ready to collapse. A faded military emblem was painted on the door, half obscured by dust and time. You sure this is the place? Carter asked, his voice shaky. The vet nodded. Only one way to find out. They pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. The vet swept his flashlight across the room, revealing old furniture, scattered papers, and a broken radio in the corner. But it wasn't the mess that caught his attention, it was the walls. Every inch of them was covered in markings. The same spiral pattern etched into his rifle, repeated over and over again. Some were small, others stretched across entire sections of the wall, jagged and chaotic. Okay, Carter said, taking a step back. This is officially the creepiest place I've ever been. The vet moved closer to the wall, running his fingers over the carvings. They felt rough, almost alive under his touch. He turned to Carter. Check the papers. See if there's anything useful. Carter nodded, though his hands were trembling as he picked up a stack of old documents. Meanwhile, the vet studied the markings, his mind racing. Whoever had been here before, they knew about the mark. They knew something he didn't. Hey, Carter called out. I think I found something. The vet turned as Carter held up a faded piece of paper. It was covered in strange symbols, but in the center was a single phrase written in shaky handwriting. The mark lead the way. What does that mean? Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before the vet could answer, a sound echoed through the outpost, a low, guttural growl that made their blood run cold. The vet raised his rifle, his eyes darting to the doorway. We're not alone, he said quietly. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like something was stalking them. Carter backed toward the corner, his rifle shaking in his hands. What do we do? The vet took a deep breath, steadying his aim. We fight. The door creaked open, and the shadows outside seemed to pour into the room, swallowing the light. Whatever was out there, it was coming for them. The shadows crept into the room like living things, twisting and writhing along the walls. The vet and Carter stood frozen, their rifles trained on the doorway as the growling grew louder. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted them to know it was coming. Stay close, the vet whispered, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. Carter nodded, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. What the hell is it? The vet didn't answer. He didn't know, and right now it didn't matter. All that mattered was surviving the next few minutes. The growling stopped, and for a brief moment, the silence was deafening. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, a shadow darted into the room. It was fast, too fast, and its shape was hard to pin down. It moved like smoke, flickering and shifting as it circled them. The vet fired a shot, the sound echoing in the small space. The bullet hit the wall, splintering the wood, but the shadow didn't even flinch. Instead, it lunged toward Carter, who stumbled back, his rifle slipping from his hands. Get down, the vet shouted, firing again. This time the bullet grazed the shadow, and for a split second it recoiled, letting out an unearthly screech. Carter scrambled to grab his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It's not going down. What do we do? The vet didn't answer. His mind raced as he watched the shadow regroup, its form solidifying just enough to reveal glowing eyes, bright, unnatural, and locked on him. He realized then that the bullets weren't enough. This thing wasn't bound by the same rules as anything he'd fought before. Carter, the markings. The vet said, his eyes darting to the walls. They might mean something. Look for anything we can use. Carter hesitated, then nodded, diving for the scattered papers on the floor. The vet kept his rifle trained on the shadow, firing whenever it got too close. Each shot seemed to slow it down, but it wasn't enough to stop it. "I've got something," Carter shouted, holding up another sheet of paper. It was covered in the same jagged spirals, but in the corner was a drawing of a strange symbol, a circle with sharp lines cutting through it. Beneath it were the words, "Mark the ground, banish the shadow." "What does that mean?" Carter yelled, his voice cracking. "Just do it." The vet snapped. "Use the knife." Carter fumbled for his combat knife, his hands shaking as he knelt on the floor. He began carving the symbol into the wooden planks, his movements frantic but precise. The vet kept firing, each shot buying Carter a few precious seconds. The shadow lunged again, this time slamming into the vet and knocking him to the ground. The air left his lungs in a sharp gasp as the shadow's weight pressed down on him. Its glowing eyes bored into his, and for a moment he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like it was trying to pull him into the darkness. "Carter," the vet choked out, struggling to push the shadow off. "Almost there," Carter shouted, his knife carving the last line of the symbol. As he finished, the symbol began to glow, a faint blue light spreading across the floor. The shadow let out a piercing screech, its form flickering and breaking apart like smoke caught in a strong wind. It thrashed wildly, its glowing eyes fading as the light from the symbol grew brighter. And then, just like that, it was gone. The vet lay on the floor, gasping for breath as Carter slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. The glowing symbol faded, leaving the room in silence once again. Did we kill it?" Carter asked, his voice shaking. The vet sat up, his hand still gripping his rifle. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But it's gone. For now." Carter nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know that either," the vet admitted. "But whatever it was, it didn't want us here." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. The vet's eyes drifted to the walls, to the countless spirals carved into the wood. Whoever had been here before, they'd known about the shadow, and they hadn't made it out. "We need to figure this out," the vet said finally, his voice grim. "If there's more of those things out there, we're going to need more than a couple of rifles and some symbols." Carter nodded, though his hand still trembled. "What now?" The vet stood, pulling Carter to his feet. "Now we find out who left these markings and why." With that, they gathered what papers they could, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they left the outpost behind. The sun was setting again, and the desert stretched out before them, empty and silent. But the vet knew better. They weren't alone, and whatever was waiting for them, it was watching. The vet and Carter trekked through the desert under a darkening sky. The heat of the day had faded, replaced by a biting chill that seeped through their jackets. Neither of them spoke much as they walked. The silence wasn't just from exhaustion. It was the weight of what they had seen. That shadow wasn't like anything they'd faced before, and the memory of its glowing eyes lingered in their minds. "Do you think it'll come back?" Carter finally asked, breaking the silence. The vet glanced at him, his face set in a grim expression. Maybe something worse." "Great," Carter muttered, kicking at a rock. "I don't know how much worse it can get." The vet didn't answer. He scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp and searching for movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, he'd catch a flicker of something in the corner of his vision, a shadow that seemed to move against the stillness of the desert. But whenever he turned to look, it was gone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they came across a dry riverbed. The cracked earth and scattered stones provided a natural path, winding between low ridges of rock. It felt safer than the open desert, but the vet knew better than to trust his surroundings. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, stopping near a cluster of boulders. Carter nodded, dropping his pack to the ground. "You think this is a good idea, staying out here?" "It's as good as it's going to get," the vet replied. "We're not making it back to camp before dark, and I don't want to risk moving when we can't see." Carter didn't argue. He helped the vet clear a small area for a fire, using dry twigs and brush they'd gathered along the way. The flames were small but warm, casting flickering shadows on the rocks around them. As they ate a meager meal from their rations, Carter couldn't keep quiet. That thing back at the outpost, it wasn't just a shadow, was it? It felt alive. The vet nodded, chewing slowly. It was alive, or something close to it, and it's not the first one. What do you mean? Carter asked, leaning forward. The vet hesitated. He didn't like sharing too much, but Carter deserved to know. The surgeon said this isn't the first time he's seen the mark or these things. It's happened before in other places. Carter swallowed hard. And what happened to the people in those places? The vet met his eyes. They didn't make it. The words hung in the air like a weight, and Carter looked away, his face pale. Great, so we're just waiting for it to pick us off. Not if we figure out how to stop it, the vet said firmly. That's why we're out here. Those markings back at the outpost, they mean something. We just have to figure out what. Carter sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. Yeah, easier said than done. The vet didn't respond. He was staring into the flames, his mind racing. The papers they'd taken from the outpost were tucked safely in his pack, but they didn't make much sense yet. Symbols, phrases like, "the marked lead the way," and scattered drawings of those spirals. Whoever had written them had been trying to understand the same thing. And they hadn't survived. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, carrying a low, mournful sound through the reverbed. Carter shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. That doesn't sound good. It's just the wind, the vet said, though he didn't entirely believe it. They took turns keeping watch, one of them always awake while the other tried to rest. The vet was on watch when he heard it. A faint, distant sound, like footsteps crunching on dry earth. He stood, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Carter," he hissed, kicking the younger soldier's boot. Carter jolted awake, grabbing his rifle. What? What is it?" "Listen." They both froze, ears straining. The footsteps came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate, not like an animal. Like something or someone was walking toward them. "Put out the fire," the vet whispered. Carter moved quickly, kicking dirt over the flames. Darkness swallowed them, and they crouched behind the boulders, their rifles trained on the direction of the sound. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, from the shadows, came a voice. "Help me, please." It was faint, weak, and human. Carter's eyes widened, and he started to stand, but the vet grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait," the vet said. "It could be a trap." "But what if it's not?" Carter whispered. "What if it's Diaz?" The vet hesitated. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Please, I'm hurt." It did sound like Diaz. The vet's mind raced. If it was Diaz, they couldn't just leave him out there. But if it wasn't, the vet made a decision. "Stay here," he told Carter. "Cover me." Carter nodded reluctantly, his rifle steady as the vet stepped out from behind the boulder, his own weapon raised. He moved slowly, every muscle in his body tense. "Who's there?" he called out. The voice didn't answer right away. Then from the darkness came a shape, a figure stumbling toward him, clutching its side. As it came closer, the vet's heart sank. It was Diaz. But something was wrong. His uniform was torn, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were sunken and glassy. He moved stiffly, like his body didn't quite fit right. "Diaz?" the vet said cautiously. The figure stopped, its head tilting to one side. And then it smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that didn't belong on a human face. "Run," it said, but this time the voice wasn't weak. It was cold, sharp, and filled with malice. The vet stepped back, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Carter, it's not him." Before he could fire, Diaz, or whatever was wearing Diaz's face, lunged at him with inhuman speed. The vet dove to the side, his shot going wide. Carter yelled, firing a burst of rounds, but the thing moved too fast, its form flickering like the shadows they'd seen before. "Idol!" the vet shouted, scrambling to his feet. "We can't fight it here." Carter didn't need to be told twice. The two of them ran, their boots pounding against the ground as the thing chased them, its laughter echoing in the night. The hunt had begun. The vet and Carter ran through the darkness, the sound of that twisted laughter chasing them. The cold night air burned in their lungs, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. But they couldn't stop. They didn't dare. "Where are we even going?" Carter shouted, his voice strained with fear. "Anywhere but here," the vet yelled back. His mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. They couldn't keep running forever, but stopping meant facing whatever that thing was. The laughter grew louder, closer, cutting through the night like a blade. Carter glanced over at his shoulder and stumbled, nearly falling. "It's still coming." The vet grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Keep moving. Don't look back." Ahead, the dry river bed opened into a narrow canyon, the walls rising high on either side. The vet led the way, hoping the rocky terrain would slow their pursuer. They ducked into the shadows of the canyon, their breathing ragged as they pressed their backs against the cool stone. "Do you think it saw us?" Carter whispered, clutching his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him alive. The vet held up a hand, signaling for silence. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his ears. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an unsettling stillness. He scanned the canyon's entrance, his grip tightening on his rifle. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the quiet rustle of the wind. Then slowly, a shadow moved at the edge of the canyon, its shape shifting and flickering like smoke. "It's here," the vet said, his voice low and steady. "Stay close." The shadow crept closer, its form solidifying into that twisted mockery of Diaz. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and its smile stretched wider, too wide for a human face. "You can't run," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. "The marked always lead us." The vet stepped forward, his rifle raised. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. The thing tilted its head as if amused. "You already know." "I don't," the vet said, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Tell me." The creature's smile faded, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "You'll understand soon enough." Without warning, it lunged. The vet fired, the shot echoing through the canyon. The bullet hit the creature, but it barely flinched, its form rippling like water before solidifying again. "Carter, run!" the vet shouted, firing again and again to keep the creature at bay. Carter hesitated, fear and indecision written all over his face. But the vet turned, his voice sharper this time. "Go, now." Carter nodded and took off, his footsteps echoing as he sprinted deeper into the canyon. The vet kept firing, backing away slowly as the creature advanced. Each shot slowed it, but only for a moment. "You can't stop me," the creature said, its voice dripping with malice. "This isn't your fight to win." The vet ignored it, his mind focused on buying Carter enough time to get away. But as his rifle clicked empty, the creature's smile returned, full of cruel delight. "Out of bullets already?" it mocked, stepping closer. The vet reached for his sidearm, but before he could draw it, the creature lashed out. Its shadowy form slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. His rifle skidded across the rocky floor, out of reach. The creature loomed over him, its glowing eyes burning into his. "The marked lead the way," it whispered, its voice low and chilling. "And you, soldier, are the key." The vet struggled, his hands scrambling for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a jagged rock, and with a burst of desperation, he swung it at the creature. The rock struck its head, and for a moment its form flickered and warped, letting out an unearthly screech. The vet didn't waste the opportunity. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his heart pounding as he followed Carter's trail through the canyon. The creature's screech echoed behind him, but its laughter was gone, replaced by something that almost sounded like rage. He caught up to Carter near the end of the canyon, where the walls opened up to the vast desert once again. Carter turned, his eyes wide with relief. "You're alive." "Barely," the vet said, his breath coming in gasps. "But it's not far behind." Carter nodded, his face pale. "What do we do now?" The vet scanned the area, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun it forever, and their weapons weren't enough to stop it. But then his eyes fell on a jagged rock formation nearby, its sharp edges silhouetted against the moonlight. "We set a trap," the vet said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "This thing might be fast, but it's not invincible. We use the terrain against it." Carter hesitated, then nodded. "All right. What do you need me to do?" The vet quickly outlined his plan, keeping his instructions simple. They didn't have much time, but if they worked together, they might just stand a chance. As the creature's footsteps echoed closer, the vet and Carter took their positions. The vet gripped his sidearm tightly, his eyes fixed on the canyon's exit. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going down without a fight. The hunt wasn't over yet. The vet crouched behind the jagged rock formation, his sidearm clutched tightly in his hands. Carter was a few feet away, hiding behind another cluster of boulders. They'd exchanged a quick nod, the silent agreement between them clear. This had to work, or it was over. The footsteps echoed louder now, accompanied by the guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. The creature was coming, its pace slow and deliberate, as if it knew there was nowhere for them to go. "Stay calm," the vet whispered, more to himself than to Carter. His grip on the pistol tightened. "Wait for it to come to us." The shadows shifted at the canyon's entrance, and then the creature emerged. It moved differently now, more solid, its glowing eyes scanning the area like it was searching for prey. Its smile stretched across its face again, unnaturally wide as it stepped closer. "You can't hide," it called out, its voice echoing in the still night air. "I can feel the mark. I can always find you." The vet's breath hitched, but he didn't move. He waited, his eyes locked on the creature as it crept closer. When it was almost within range, he gave the signal, a quick flick of his hand. Carter sprang into action, stepping out from his hiding spot and firing a burst of rounds at the creature. The bullet struck, forcing it to stumble back, its form rippling and flickering like smoke. "Now!" the vet shouted, leaping from his position. He fired his sidearm, each shot aimed with precision. The creature screeched, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned its attention to him. It lunged. The vet dove to the side, rolling across the rocky ground as the creature's shadowy form crashed into the spot where he'd been. It twisted around, its movements jerky and unnatural, as it prepared to strike again. "Carter! The rocks!" the vet yelled, scrambling to his feet. Carter nodded and bolted toward the ridge above the creature. He grabbed the loose boulders they had prepared and shoved them with all his strength. The rocks tumbled down, crashing onto the creature with a deafening roar. For a moment, the dust and debris obscured everything. The vet coughed, his hand shielding his face as he waited for the dust to settle. When it did, his heart sank. The creature was still there. It was pinned under the rubble, its form flickering and warping as it tried to pull itself free. Its glowing eyes locked onto the vet, filled with fury. "You think this will stop me?" it hissed, its voice a venomous growl. "The mark cannot be undone." The vet didn't respond. He stepped closer, his sidearm raised. He knew this was their chance, maybe their only chance to end this thing. He glanced at Carter, who was frozen in place, staring at the creature with wide eyes. "Carter," the vet barked. "Find something sharp. We need to carve the symbol." Carter snapped out of his daze, nodding quickly as he searched the ground for a sharp rock. The vet kept his aim steady, his heart pounding as the creature thrashed against the rubble. Its movements were slower now, weaker, but it wasn't giving up. "You can't kill me," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "I am bound to the mark. As long as it exists, so do I." The vet's jaw tightened. "Then we'll destroy the mark." Carter returned, holding a jagged rock in his trembling hands. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Carve the symbol," the vet said, his eyes never leaving the creature. "The one we saw at the outpost. Do it on the ground, right in front of it." Carter hesitated, but the vet's sharp tone snapped him into action. He dropped to his knees, using the rock to carve the strange symbol into the dirt. The creature screeched, its voice rising in a piercing wail as Carter worked. "No," it cried, its form flickering wildly. "You don't understand what you're doing. Just keep going," the vet shouted. Carter finished the symbol, and the moment the last line was carved, the air around them seemed to shift. The wind picked up, swirling dust and debris into a chaotic storm. The symbol on the ground began to glow, the same faint blue light they'd seen at the outpost. The creature thrashed violently, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a gale. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and its voice turned from a scream to a low, guttural growl. "You cannot escape the mark," it whispered, its words barely audible. "It will find you again." And then, with one final flicker, it was gone. The vet and Carter collapsed to the ground, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The glowing symbol faded, leaving behind only the faint outlines of the carving in the dirt. Did we get it?" Carter asked, his voice shaking. The vet sat up slowly, his eyes scanning the area. The canyon was silent now, the oppressive weight that had hung over them finally lifted. He nodded, for now. Carter leaned back against a boulder, his hands still trembling. What did it mean? About the mark finding us again? The vet didn't answer right away. He stared at his rifle, at the jagged spiral etched into the metal. "I don't know," he said finally. "But we're not done yet." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of what they had just survived pressing down on them. The vet didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. The mark wasn't finished with them. And whatever was coming next, they'd have to face it together. The night was quiet again, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the calm before the storm. The vet and Carter didn't stay in the canyon long. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift in ways they couldn't explain. Even though the creature was gone, the vet couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Let's keep moving," the vet said, breaking the silence. He stood, brushing dirt from his jacket and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "We need to find somewhere safe before dawn." Carter groaned as he pushed himself up from the ground. "Safe? I'm starting to think that word doesn't mean much anymore." The vet gave him a half smile. "It's all relative, kid. Let's go." They made their way out of the canyon, sticking close to the shadows as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, but the vet's eyes scanned every rock and ridge. He wasn't taking any chances. After a few hours of walking, they came across a small, abandoned structure, a weathered shack half buried in the sand. It didn't look like much, but it was shelter, and that was good enough. The vet pushed open the door, his rifle raised. The inside was empty except for a broken table and a few crates stacked in the corner. It smelled of dust and decay, but it was quiet, safe. For now, the vet muttered under his breath. Carter flopped onto the floor with a groan, leaning back against the wall. "I can't feel my legs. Are we just going to keep running forever?" The vet sat down across from him, resting his rifle against the wall. "No, but we're not ready to stop yet. Not until we figure out what's really going on." Carter let out a bitter laugh. "Figure it out? We can't even stop one of those things without almost getting killed. What's the point?" "The point," the vet said, his tone firm, "is that we're still here. And as long as we're still here, we've got a shot." Carter didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped. The vet sighed, pulling out the papers they'd taken from the outpost. He spread them out on the ground, scanning the strange symbols and cryptic phrases. "What are you looking for?" Carter asked, his voice tired. "Patterns," the vet said. "Anything that connects the mark, the shadows, and these symbols. There's got to be a reason all this is happening." Carter leaned forward, squinting at one of the pages. "What about this?" He pointed to a drawing of the spiral surrounded by smaller symbols. Beneath it was a single word, "Anchor." "Anchor," the vet repeated, frowning. "What does that mean?" Carter shrugged. "No idea. But it keeps showing up. Look." He grabbed another page, tapping at the same words scribbled in the margin. The vet's brow furrowed as he stared at the pages. Anchor. It had to mean something, something important. He traced the spiral with his finger, his mind racing. "What if the mark isn't just a beacon?" The vet said slowly. "What if it's holding something?" Carter's eyes widened. "Holding what?" The vet shook his head. "I don't know. But if the mark is an anchor, maybe it's keeping whatever's behind these shadows tied to this world." Carter's face paled. "So if we destroy the mark..." The vet didn't answer. He wasn't sure what would happen if they destroyed the mark, and that uncertainty was more dangerous than anything they'd faced so far. But it was a lead, and it was all they had. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards of the shack. Carter shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. "You think more of those things are coming?" The vet glanced at the window, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, but we need to be ready." They spent the rest of the day preparing, reinforcing the shack as best they could and going over their limited supplies. The vet couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The shadows weren't just hunting them, they were closing in. As night fell, the vet sat by the window, his rifle in his lap. Carter was asleep in the corner, his breathing steady. For a moment, the vet allowed himself to relax, letting the quiet settle over him. And then he saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, a figure stood motionless. Its form was dark and flickering like a shadow that didn't belong. The vet's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. The vet didn't wake Carter. Not yet. He stared at the figure, his mind racing. Was it the same creature? Or something worse? As the minutes stretched into hours, the figure didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It was a reminder, a silent threat that they couldn't escape. When the first light of dawn broke, the figure was gone. The vet exhaled, his body tense with exhaustion. He didn't know what the shadows wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't done yet. And neither was he. The vet hadn't slept, but he didn't need to. Years of military life had taught him how to keep going, even when exhaustion clawed at him. Carter stirred awake as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shack's walls. "Morning," Carter asked groggily, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Barely," the vet replied, his voice low. He was still staring out the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of the shadowy figure. It hadn't come back, but that didn't mean it was gone. Carter yawned, glancing at the rifle resting beside him. "Anything happened last night?" The vet hesitated. Not sure. There was something. It didn't get close, but it was watching. Carter's face paled. "Still them?" "Probably." The vet finally turned away from the window, standing and stretching his stiff limbs. "We need to move." Carter groaned. "Move where?" "There's nothing out here but sand and more sand." The vet crouched by the papers they'd spread out the night before, his eyes scanning the strange symbols and scattered phrases. His fingers tapped on the word anchor again. "We find this," the vet said, pointing to the word. "Whatever it means, it's connected to the mark. And if we're going to stop this, we need to understand it." "Easier said than done," Carter muttered, standing and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Where do we even start?" The vet held up one of the pages. "Here. There's a set of coordinates scribbled in the corner. Looks like whoever wrote this was trying to track something." Carter leaned over, squinting at the faded numbers. "You think it's a location?" "Only one way to find out," the vet said. "But it's not close. We'll need to pack light and move fast." Carter sighed, but he didn't argue. "All right, let's do it." They gathered their gear, taking only what they could carry. The vet kept the papers tucked safely in his jacket, along with the map the surgeon had given him. As they stepped out into the desert, the morning sun cast long shadows over the sand. The vet led the way, his eyes sharp and scanning the horizon. The coordinates were a good distance away, and they didn't have much daylight to waste. Carter followed close behind, his steps heavier and slower than usual. "Do you think this anchor thing is real?" Carter asked after a while, breaking the silence. "I don't know," the vet admitted. "But whoever wrote those notes believed it, and they knew more about this than we do." "That's not saying much," Carter muttered, but there was no real bitterness in his tone, just fear. The day stretched on, the sun beating down on them as they made their way across the barren landscape. The vet's instincts kept him on edge, every gust of wind and shifting shadow making his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, even though there was nothing to see. By the time the sun began to set, they reached a small ridge overlooking a dry valley. The vet checked the map and the coordinates again, his brow furrowing. "This is it." Carter looked around, frowning. There's nothing here." The vet didn't respond. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something half buried in the sand near the center of the valley. "There," he said, pointing. The two of them made their way down the ridge, their boots crunching on the dry ground. As they got closer, the vet realized it was some kind of stone slab, its surface etched with strange markings. The spirals were there again, along with other symbols he didn't recognize. "What is this?" Carter asked, crouching down to brush the sand off the slab. "Looks ancient." "Maybe it is," the vet said, his voice quiet. He traced the carvings with his fingers, trying to make sense of them. In the center of the slab was a circular indentation, smooth and polished, like something was meant to fit there. "What do you think goes in that?" Carter asked, pointing to the indentation. The vet shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's the key to this whole thing." Before Carter could respond, the air around them grew colder, the wind picking up and whipping sand across their faces. The vet stood, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. "They're coming," he said, his voice steady. Carter scrambled to his feet, his own rifle at the ready. What do we do? The vet's eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the shadows began to shift and twist, rising like smoke from the ground. We hold them off. Whatever this slab is, it's important. We can't let them take it. Carter swallowed hard, his grip on his rifle tightening. I hope you're right about this. The vet didn't answer. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as the first shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and that cruel, unnatural smile spread across its face. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first shadow moved toward them, its glowing eyes fixed on the vet and Carter. Behind it, more figures began to take shape, their forms flickering and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. The vet raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. Carter, stay close to the slab, the vet said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. We hold the line here. Carter nodded, though his hands shook as he adjusted his grip on the rifle. How many of these things are there? Doesn't matter, the vet replied. We don't let them get past us. The first shadow lunged, moving faster than the vet could track. He fired a shot, the bullet ripping through the creature's form. It screeched, its shape flickering for a moment before it surged forward again. Shoot to slow them down, the vet shouted, firing again. The second shot hit the shadow, forcing it to retreat slightly. They're not invincible, but they don't go down easy. Carter opened fire, his bullets hitting another shadow that had crept closer. The creature snarled, its form rippling like water as it recoiled. I don't think we can hold them all off, Carter yelled, panic creeping into his voice. We don't have to, the vet said, his mind racing. He glanced at the slab at the circular indentation in its center. We just need to figure out how to activate this thing. Carter fired another burst of rounds, his jaw clenched. And how are we supposed to do that? The vet didn't answer. He scanned the carvings on the slab, his eyes darting between the spirals and symbols. His mind flashed back to the notes they'd taken from the outpost. The word anchor scrawled next to drawings of the spirals. It's an anchor, the vet muttered to himself, piecing it together. It's meant to hold something in place, or keep something out. What are you talking about? Carter asked, firing another shot. The shadows were closing in, their numbers growing with each passing second. The vet knelt by the slab, his fingers tracing the carvings. The shadows are tied to the mark. If this slab is an anchor, it might be able to sever that connection. Great, Carter said, his voice strained as he reloaded. And how do we do that before they kill us? The vet's eyes locked on the circular indentation. Something fits here. A key. Carter glanced around frantically. A key. Out here? Where are we supposed to find that? The vet's hand went to his chest, where the dog tags around his neck rested. He hesitated, then pulled them off, staring at the small, warm metal. It wasn't much, but the circular shape gave him an idea. Cover me, the vet said, stepping toward the slab. Carter's eyes widened. Wait, what are you? Just do it. The vet snapped, his voice firm. Carter gritted his teeth and turned back to the advancing shadows, firing wildly to keep them at bay. The vet knelt by the slab and placed the dog tag into the circular indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the symbols on the slab began to glow, faint at first, then brighter. The air around them shifted, the temperature dropping sharply. The shadows hissed, their forms flickering violently as the glowing symbols grew stronger. It's working, Carter shouted, a mix of relief and panic in his voice. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The vet pressed his hand against the slab, the glowing light spreading to his fingers. A surge of energy coursed through him, and for a moment he felt like he was connected to the slab, to the symbols, to something far beyond the desert. The shadows screamed, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. One by one they dissolved, their glowing eyes fading into nothingness. The vet gritted his teeth, holding his hand against the slab as the light grew almost blinding. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The light faded, leaving the slab cold and dark once again. The vet collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Carter rushed to his side, his face pale. You okay? Carter asked, kneeling beside him. The vet nodded weakly, pushing himself up. I think so. Carter looked around, his rifle still in his hands. They're gone. The shadows, they're gone. For now, the vet said, his voice low. He glanced at the slab, at the faint glow still lingering in its carvings. But this isn't over. Carter frowned. What do you mean? We beat them, didn't we? The vet met his eyes, his expression grim. This slab didn't destroy them. It just pushed them back. And if the mark is still out there, they'll come back. Carter didn't respond. He just stared at the slab, the weight of their situation sinking in. The vet stood, rushing himself off and picking up his rifle. We need to move, the vet said. If there's a way to end this for good, it's not here. Carter nodded reluctantly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Where do we go now? The vet glanced at the horizon, where the first rays of dawn were breaking through the darkness. Forward. Always forward. They left the slab behind, their shadows stretching long across the sand as they walked. The vet didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. Not yet.